So I took on this kickoff topic because I knew it would pose a challenge to many of the perspectives I held for well over a decade. Like many comrades in our organization and around the world, Leon Trotsky has served as a key theoretical and historical actor in preserving the revolutionary traditions of Marx, Engels, and Lenin. The first Marxist work I ever read was Trotsky's monumental text, My Life, an Attempt at an Autobiography. And as a committed Trotskyist for well over a decade, I once believed that criticizing Trotsky's positions on the nature of the Soviet Union after Lenin's death, as well as his strategic orientations toward combating the pervasive influence of Stalinism, did nothing to advance the cause of preserving genuine Bolshevism. If anything, criticizing Trotskyism represented one of two tendencies in my head. It came from either the diluted perspective of bourgeois reform, which rejected the Russian Revolution altogether, or Stalinism, and any critiques of Trotskyist orthodoxy from the left were roundly disregarded as either anarchist distortions or other eclectical tendencies that propagated ultra-leftism. However, viewing Trotsky as an infallible messiah who could not err in his own positions, despite his immense theoretical and political genius, continues to be a disservice to the man himself and our movement as a whole. In his autobiography, Trotsky pointed out that the rigid and in many ways blindly religious distortions of Leninism by Stalinists in the USSR had transformed Lenin into an unquestionable prophet who disseminated revolutionary commandments from the heavens. Quote, the attitude toward Lenin as a revolutionary leader gave way to an attitude like that toward the head of an ecclesiastical hierarchy. Against Trotsky's protests, a mausoleum was built on the Red Square, a monument unbecoming and offensive to the revolutionary consciousness. The official books about Lenin evolved into similar mausoleums. His ideas were cut up into quotations for hypocritical sermons. His embalmed corpse was used as a weapon against the living Lenin. End quote. Unfortunately, we see much of the same from an Orthodox Trotskyist tradition which incessantly cites the revolution betrayed in the transitional program like holy texts that are impervious to criticism. So, in the interest of time, I'd like to present an abridged version of Trotsky's life before delving into my critique. In addition to Marx, Engels, and Lenin, Leon Trotsky is one of the towering figures of revolutionary Marxism. The evocation of his name, whether it's a defense of genuine Bolshevism from Stalinist distortions or schooling erroneous liberals who equate Marxism with Stalinism, continues to inspire revolutionaries around the world and often sparks spirited debate over the meaning of Marxism. Born Lev Davidovich Bronstein in what is now Berezklavka, Ukraine, Trotsky would emerge as a central actor in the Russian Revolution and the international communist movement. As a young revolutionary, he became a prolific writer, orator, and organizer of the nascent working class movement in Imperial Russia, thereby garnering the ire of both the Tsarist regime and the rising Russian bourgeoisie. Upon escaping his first round of imprisonment, Trotsky would join the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party and first met Lenin while he was exiled in London. Endearingly referred to as the pen by Lenin due to his prolific writing capabilities, Trotsky would initially split with Lenin over issues related to RSDLP unity and sided with Julius Martov's Mensheviks over Lenin's Bolsheviks. However, after the failure of the Russian Revolution of 1905, Trotsky would admit to coming to Lenin in, quote, his own way. And after spending years in exile between 1905 and early 1917, Trotsky would return to Russia as a key figure in leading the Bolshevik Party to revolutionary victory in the October Revolution and protecting the revolution afterwards as the fearless leader and organizer of the Workers' and Peasants' Red Army. However, after Lenin's untimely death in 1923, Trotsky entered a ruthless struggle against the rise of Stalinism and state capitalist degeneration in the Soviet Union. Note the choice of verbiage. The Stalinist assault on the revolutionary gains of Bolshevism began at least 2 to 3 years prior to Lenin's death, especially after the market-oriented new economic policy, enacted in response to the devastation of the Civil War, had created a powerful new kulak class and privileged bureaucratic strata which rallied around Stalin's personage in the party apparatus, particularly in the Central Committee. Lenin had been alarmed by this tendency before Trotsky even considered it as a serious threat to revolutionary democracy. Nevertheless, Lenin's concerns were proven to be unequivocally correct, and Trotsky, surrounded by many old Bolsheviks who also recognized this degeneration, formed the left opposition bloc. However, despite the firm Bolshevik-Leninist convictions of the left opposition, they erroneously believed that the USSR had remained a workers' state, albeit deformed, under Stalinism, thereby negating the need for a second social revolution and instead allowing for the possibility of restoring Soviet democracy through political means. This conclusion would prove to be a fatal miscalculation by the left opposition, as the new Soviet ruling class that arose from the crippling effects of civil war, economic isolation, and historical backwardness would never concede power through democratic means. The infrastructure of the Soviet power, i.e., the impetus of the October Revolution, which was built upon the solid foundation of direct democratic workers' councils, had been hijacked and mutilated by a bureaucracy dedicated to profiting from the surplus of the toiling masses via a rapid industrialization process unfolding under the authoritarian command of this new Thermidor. Nevertheless, the left opposition held this position until it was too late to reassess. To quote Trotsky in chapter 44 of his autobiography published in 1930, quote, "The policy of the opposition has nothing to do with preparation for an armed struggle. We are guided wholly by a conviction of the profound vitality and elasticity of the Soviet regime. Our course is one of inner reform." End quote. There's a picture of the left opposition there. So by the end of the 1920s, the vast majority of Trotsky's left opposition comrades in the Soviet Union were butchered by the Stalinist regime. In turn, Trotsky was exiled from the land of the October Revolution for the remainder of his life. However, despite this exile, Trotsky would continue to wage a ruthless theoretical and political struggle against Stalinism until he was assassinated in cold blood by a Stalinist agent in Mexico in 1940. Thus, the October Revolution's second in command, the great Marxist theoretician who refined and unequivocally proved the necessity of an international permanent revolution, the founder of the Red Army, was dead. But nevertheless, the power of his ideas and tireless struggle to uphold the authentic traditions of Bolshevik Leninism live on. This does not mean, however, that Comrade Trotsky was more than a man. Like all of us, he had many faults, and in turn, he also made key strategic mistakes and theoretical blunders in response to the rise of Stalinism. Duncan Hallas opens his article, Trotskyism Reassessed, with the following, quote, "First, Trotsky fought to preserve the authentic communist tradition, the tradition of the early Communist International, in the only way that it could or can be preserved, by developing it and embodying it in a living moment. Second, the extremely unfavorable circumstances of the time not only defeated his efforts so far as immediate large-scale results were concerned, but also led to characteristic distortions and deformations of the tradition itself as it came to be embodied in the various Trotskyist groupings. Third, while Trotsky was aware of this and fought vigorously against certain of the deformations, he himself contributed to fostering some of them." End quote. It is important to emphasize that the historical and material conditions which brought about the rise of Stalinism in the Soviet Union largely unfolded outside of Trotsky and Lenin's control after the devastation of the First Imperialist World War and subsequent Russian Civil War. Regardless of Trotsky's immense capacities as a revolutionary politician, military leader, and Marxist theoretician, he could not initially overcome his own stubborn convictions. And by the polemical tone of his writings at the time, Trotsky was also dedicated to his own defense against Stalinist accusations, which painted him as a counter-revolutionary, fascist collaborator, and traitor of the Leninist tradition. But the reality of Trotsky's personal situation does not negate the key error of his appraisal of the Soviet regime under Stalinism as one of profound vitality and elasticity. To quote Hallas once again, "Until late 1933, Trotsky had maintained that the working classes of the USSR had the possibility of recapturing the bureaucratized state by peaceful and legal means, without a new revolution, with the methods and on the road of reform. However unrealistic in fact, this position enabled Trotsky to reconcile the Marxist conception of the working class as the active agent of the socialist revolution with his description of the USSR under Stalin's dictatorship as a workers' state. Once this reformist perspective was abandoned, as it was in October of 1933, there was a built-in contradiction in Trotsky's theoretical system. At the time, it did not have any very important practical consequences, and the USSR, which indisputably originated from a genuine proletarian revolution, could be regarded as a very special case. End quote. Regardless of the glaring reality of Stalinism's betrayal of the principles of Bolshevism, the Soviet Union had simultaneously become a bastion of revolutionary authority in the eyes of workers all over the world, especially after the failure of revolutionary attempts in Germany and Russia, though these failures can largely be attributed to reactionary decisions made by the Stalinist Comintern after Lenin's death. So as the major communist parties around the world were captured by the firmly entrenched power of Stalinism, Trotsky and his supporters faced a myriad of organizational and strategic challenges. Nevertheless, as the Comintern was also fully captured by Stalinism, Trotsky realized that founding a Fourth International had become an imperative necessity. The challenges facing the Fourth International were undoubtedly connected to the mistakes and political fetishes of the various Trotskyist groupings and Trotsky himself. According to Hallas, quote, Trotskyism had been forced into an intellectualist milieu, and Trotsky was acutely aware of the need to break out of it. Objective conditions made it extremely difficult. Subjective circumstances, the social nature of the Trotskyists, became an additional obstacle. But Trotsky compounded the difficulties. He denounced closed circles, literary arrogance, conceit, and grand airs. Yet, at the same time, Trotsky insisted that the cadres can only be educated if all questions are debated by the whole opposition. Questions of general revolutionary tactics and internal questions must be the property of every member of the opposition organization. This approach inevitably further strengthened the intellectualist tendencies to which the petty bourgeois nature of the movement gave rise and made effective involvement in the workers' movement still more difficult. End quote. Unfortunately, much of the same is still evident in the Orthodox Trotskyist tendencies of today, as their intellectualist leaders are presented as the ultimate authorities on questions of theory, strategy, and orientation towards the ebb and flow of the class struggle. Rank-and-file opposition to these thought leaders who present themselves as the rightful heirs of Trotsky's legacy is largely discouraged and, in many cases, deliberately suppressed. As a former member of an Orthodox Trotskyist organization, I can certainly attest that this was my experience, even though I established close relationships with other rank-and-file comrades. Another key problem with Orthodox Trotskyist strategy has been the tactic of entryism. This tactic came about when Trotsky abandoned the lost cause of reforming Stalinist parties after fascism came to power in Europe. Hallas refers to the weakness and limited size of the Trotskyist groups, as well as their petty bourgeois intellectual tendencies, as the catalyst which brought Trotsky to this conclusion. After initial attempts to regroup with various left social democratic/centrist formations, mainly unsuccessfully, Trotsky proposed entry into the social democratic parties. Strictly speaking, this was argued for specific cases, France at first, but it came to be generalized in practice. The argument was that social democrats were moving left, creating a more favorable climate for revolutionary work, that they were attracting new layers of workers and were an incomparably more proletarian environment than the propaganda groups Trotskyism inhabited. The operation was conceived as a short-term one, a sharp, hard fight with the reformists and centrists to rally the potentially revolutionary forces, then split and found the party. End quote. So among the most burning and difficult questions that continue to be debated in our movement is the question of a proper revolutionary program, a question which has not arrived at a closing point of universal agreement for all Marxist revolutionaries, especially among those who identify with any of the varying Trotskyist traditions. According to Hallas, quote, the defense of the program inevitably loomed very large and for some came to have an almost mystical significance. Some of Trotsky's own formulations, though not his practice, lend some color to this deviation. But Marxism is a synthesis of theory and practice, No program is of any value unless it leads to practical activity necessary to achieve its aims. Again, it has to be stressed that circumstances forced a degree of program fetishism on the Trotskyist groups. It is still very much alive among some of the Trotskyist grouplets today. End quote. For Orthodox Trotskyists, this question was resolved as soon as Trotsky penned and published his transitional program in 1938, as the Marxist left had been divided on the proper orientation toward demands for reform from a revolutionary angle since Marx's lifetime. In his article, Do We Support Reformist Demands?, Hallas also writes, quote, as Rosa Luxemburg pointed out, on the one hand, the trade union struggle and parliamentary practice are considered to be the means of guiding and educating the proletariat in preparation for the task of taking over power. And on the other hand, capitalism is not overthrown, but is on the contrary strengthened by the development of social reforms in the course of democracy. End quote. So, regardless of a revolutionary program's intentions and grounding in Marxist fundamentals, historical context, especially the status of the correlation of revolutionary forces and proletarian class consciousness in a given historical moment, is key to any program's relevance and applicability. As Hallas aptly explained as he wrote this article from Great Britain in 1973, quote, for the greater part of the period between the February and October revolutions in Russia in 1917, the central political message of the Bolsheviks was summed up in 3 words: peace, land, bread. But these were indeed transitional demands, the most effective ones, in the particular conditions of Russia at that time. They are also quite useless for Britain in 1973. In fact, the whole question of transitional demands, whether they are possible and what they are, depends on the economic and political balance of forces, on perspectives. The idea that there are these magical demands that can be found in a book or a program and can be applied independently of the situation is absurd. End quote. While it is incontestable that revolutionary communists must apply the foundational lens of Marxist analysis in ascertaining proper strategic and theoretical orientations in a given historical moment, assuming that any revolutionary program posing very specific transitional demands is ironclad and universally applicable is ahistorical and frankly not Marxist, regardless if it was penned by one of Marxism's greatest practitioners. The problem with Orthodox Trotskyism is that its proponents ardently defend this text and the revolution portrayed as invulnerable to criticism or reevaluation. 85 years have passed since Trotsky's death, and in that time, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. The contradictions of global capitalism have reached a fever pitch which threatens all life on Earth, and the revolutionary left is regaining clarity and strength after decades of eclectic distortion and electoral fetishism. Therefore, maintaining the clarity and concision of Bolshevik-Leninist principles, as well as applying these principles to the ebb and flow of the class struggle, requires flexibility without compromising our position as proletarian revolutionaries. Upholding a text like Trotsky's transitional program as a universally applicable doctrine for every circumstance does not allow this. Our movement will forever be indebted to Leon Trotsky and all revolutionaries who have followed his lead in preserving the legacy and undying relevance of genuine Marxism. As everyone on this call knows, we are at a critical point in the history of our species and this planet, as Rosa Luxemburg's immortal proclamation that humanity will either arrive at socialism or barbarism has become abundantly clear. Therefore, fighting capitalism with the sharp weapons of Bolshevik-Leninism is an imperative necessity. Trotsky's invaluable contributions to this tradition cannot be denied. Nevertheless, he, and Lenin before him, was only one human being, a remarkable one to be clear, and he was certainly not impervious to mistakes. In fact, I would argue that he would view any lack of criticism as a disservice to his own work, as he was well aware of the greater meaning of Marxism and its scientific rigor. He was also well aware that all people, regardless of their revolutionary attributes or theoretical genius, were fallible. I'd like to close with the conclusion to his autobiography. Quote, in his views, his character, his world outlook, Proudhon, a Robinson Crusoe of socialism, is alien to me. But Proudhon had the nature of a fighter, a spiritual disinterestedness, a capacity for despising official public opinion, and finally, the fire of a many-sided curiosity never extinguished. This enabled him to rise above his own life, with its ups and downs, as he did above all contemporaneous reality. On April 26, 1852, Proudhon wrote to a friend from prison, "The movement is no doubt irregular and crooked, but the tendency is constant. What every government does in turn in favor of revolution becomes inviolable. What is attempted against it passes over like a cloud. I enjoy watching this spectacle, in which I understand every single picture. I observe these changes in the life of the world as if I had received their explanation from above. What oppresses others elevates me more and more, inspires and fortifies me. How can you want me then to accuse destiny, to complain about people and curse them? Destiny, I laugh at it." And Trotsky concludes with the following: "Despite their slight savor of ecclesiastical eloquence, those are fine words. I subscribe to them."